Unit 4 Sustainable Development. Contents 4.1 Introduction, 4.2 Sustainable Development Historical Context, 4.3 Sustainable Development Genesis and Evolution, 4.4 Concept of Sustainable Development as defined in Our Common Future, 4.5 Criticism of the Concept of Sustainable Development, 4.6 Globalization and Future of Sustainable Development, 4.7 Conclusion, 4.8 Further Reading. Learning objectives. This unit aims to discuss historical context of the emergence of the concept of sustainable development, genesis, evolution, and expansion of this concept. Sustainable development as our common future. Vagueness and political concept of sustainable development and future of sustainable development in context of globalization. 4.1 Introduction. In this block, after studying Unit 1 and 3, we have already learned some of the important concepts related to the process of development. By now, we are familiar with the concepts such as progress, change, modernization, development, social development, human development, and gender development. We have seen that the concept of development is constantly being critically reviewed, and as a result of our conception of development has been undergoing changes. In the last 4 decades, there is a growing awareness and activism relating to worsening environmental situation at the local and national and global levels. The emerging environmental concerns have once again led to the reconsideration of our conception, goals, and strategies of development. As a result of this, our conception of development has experienced a paradigm shift, and this has its expansion in the concept of sustainable development, which emerged in the 1980s as it continues to dominate the development discourses at various levels. This unit deals with this concept. An attempt to trace the roots of the concept of sustainable development and the historical context which gave rise to the development of environmental debate is made in the first session of this unit. The second session attempts to locate the genesis and traces of the evolution of this concept through some of the prominent international events or documents. The third section is devoted to elaborating the concept of sustainable development in terms of its definition, meaning, requirement, policy objectives, and strategic measures as conceived in the Brundtland Commission's report, Our Common Future. In the final section, we will make an attempt to understand the criticism of the concept of sustainable development as well as the future of sustainable development in its globalization era. 4.2 Sustainable Development, Historical Context. The early roots of concept of sustainable development can be traced back to the development environmental debate. The economic growth model development, its adoption by most of the countries in the world, and a realization of the consequences of it produced in various forms of environment degradation has provided the historical context for the rise of the development and environmental debate. The economic growth model of development is characterized by the use of modern technology, the factory system of production, and rapid industrialization and urbanization. The Western countries initially followed this model of development and prescribed it for the less developed ones. The predominant underlying belief was that the underdeveloped countries would eventually catch up with the industrialized countries provided they emulate the economic and social systems of the West. The less developed countries adopt the Western model of development rather uncritically. The consequences of adoptions of the session model of development by less developed countries were not at all positive. Economic growth occurred, but it was accompanied by a widened gulf between the countries in the north and the south, and it also helped to promote economic disparities between rich and the poor sections within a particular society. It was realized that development conceived simply as economic growth was an inadequate notion, and that economic growth does not necessarily lead to the development of lower strata of society. This realization caused a shift in development thinking and eventually led to the inclusion of some additional criteria of development such as distributive justice or equality, and improvement in overall equality of life of the masses. Moreover, it is more important to note that the examination of the impact of the Western model of development on equality of global environment has led to the critical reconsideration of this model of development. It is raised there that the reckless pursuit of industrialization and the use of resource exploitative modern technology for development have resulted in environmental deterioration to such an extent that the very existence of all the living species is endangered. There is a general agreement that the economic expansion, especially during the post-World war period has had alarming consequences of the global environment. Industrialization required a continuous supply of energy and materials from nature. It led to the constant accumulation of waste that resulted from accelerated industrial production and increased level of consumption. There was a gradual deterioration of nature. The modern industrial form of production induced increasingly severe degree of social inequality and growing environmental instability and degradation, which together have more recent been conceptualized as the crisis of modernity. The environmental degradation that has occurred is marked by the large-scale extraction of finite natural resources, loss of forest, extinction of animal and plant species, depletion of the ozone layer, air, water, and soil pollution, loss of marine life and biodiversity, etc., have occurred at an alarming rate and have posed a serious threat to the very survival of life on this planet. While examining the consequences of Western model of development in the context of ecosystem and economies of developed nations, Sunita Narayan comments that the Western economic and technological model is highly material and energy intensive. It metabolizes the huge quantities of natural resources and leaves a trail of toxins with the highly degraded and transformed ecosystem in its wake. It is this model that developing nations are also following for economic and social growth, leading to an extraordinary cocktail of poverty and inequality side by side with growing economics, pollution, and large-scale ecological destruction. It is recognized that the Western development model, in its most triumphant moments, appears to be neither desirable nor universally applicable because it is simply not sustainable. Thus, the two basic assumptions of the Western model of development, that is, first, development could be universalized in space, and second, that it should be durable in time, had lost their validity. Due to the strategies adopted for economic growth, environmental degradation and exploitation of natural resources have become global phenomena. Eventually, the increasing awareness of environmental problems has led to the emergence of environmentalism. It is important to note that the environmentalism had added an important dimension to the ongoing development discourse. In fact, it has caused a paradigm shift in our vision of development. It has compelled the intellectual concern to think about what is being done to the ecosystem of this planet in the name of development. The worsening environmental situation has led to the re-examination and reconsideration of the policies, strategies, and programs for development. As a result, the environmental development debate emerged and became intensified in due course of time. Initially, development and environment were seen as distinct entities. There was a sharp division between those who supported development over environment and those who argued for environment over development. As another scholar observes, there emerged two different camps of protagonists who inhabited two different mental spaces and regarded themselves as opponents. This gave rise to the dichotomy of development versus environment. However, eventually there also emerged an increased awareness about the fact that human beings need both development and environment. As Belletmas has expressed, there was a growing recognition that the overall goals of environment and development are not in conflict but are indeed the same, namely the improvement of human quality of life or welfare of present and future generation. Such thinking led to view of development versus environment is a false dichotomy. This view is well articulated in World Development Report 1992, Development and the Environment. It is argued in this report that the economic development and sound environmental management are complementary aspects of same agenda. Without adequate environmental protection, development will be undermined. Without development, environmental protection will fail. Income growth will provide the resources for improved environmental management. In fact, such a view underscored the need of reconciliation between development and environment. The concepts of sustainable development as defined in the report of the World Commission of Environment and Development titled Our Common Future represents such a attempt to reconcile the goals of development as well as that of environmental protection Before we study the definition and meaning of this concept, let us look at its genesis and environment evolution. Reflections and action 4.1. What do you mean by sustainable development? How it is relevant in present day context? 4.3. Sustainable development, genesis and evolution. According to Eduardo Sevilla Guzman and Graham Woodgate, the concept of a sustainable development was the result of a dynamic generalization, dynamic gestation. Hence, they have attempted to trace its genesis in official international discourses. They have reviewed various international events and publications and schematically brought out their discovery, product, and character. Adopting a similar approach, a brief review of the major international events, documents, and their contribution to making the concept of sustainable development is outlined here. In 1972, the United Nations Conference on Human Environment took place in Stockholm, Sweden. The Stockholm Conference was historical in the sense that environment problem received a formal recognition for the first time at global level. The modern industrial societies could realize that there is only one world. It was also recognized that environment problems are global problems requiring international solutions, although the development countries of the north and the developing countries of the south do not necessarily share the same environmental concerns. A report titled Limits to Growth, the work of the Club of Rome, has been credited as the first official study of global environmental deterioration. In this report, there is ecological analysis of industrialism. The report also focused on predicted result of continuing level of resource depletion, pollution, and population growth. Due to this report, a sense of realizations grew that infinite growth was impossible with infinite resources. Then a diagnostic of factors of global environmental deterioration brought out in a report titled Global 2000 commissioned by US President Jimmy Carter and published in 1980 underscored the northern lifestyle cannot be reproduced globally. Then in year 1981, the concept of sustainable development appeared for the first time. It was enshrined in the title of a key document, World Conservation Strategy, Living Resource Conservation for Sustainable Development, published by International Union of Conservation of Nature and Natural Resources, the World Wildlife Fund, and UN Environmental Program. According to the strategy definition, for development to be sustainable, it must take account of social and ecological factors as well as economic ones of the living and non-living resource base, and of the long-term as well as short-term advantages and disadvantages of alternative actions. In 1983, the United Nations set up the World Commission of Environment and Development, headed by Gro Harlem Brundtland, Prime Minister of Norway, as an independent body. Its objective was to re-examine the critical environment and development problems on planet and to formulate realistic proposals to solve them and to ensure that human progress will be sustainable through development without bankrupting the resources of the future generation. WCED published its report titled Our Common Future in the year 1987. This report presented the first official definition of the concept of sustainable development. The contribution of a common future is threefold. It offers the first official definition of sustainable development. It suggested for the first time an international strategy for confronting the crisis of modernity, and it brings out a paradigm change in conventional thinking regarding the notion of development. Another document, Caring for the Earth, a strategy of sustainable living, has suggested a revised global strategy for conservation of nature. More importantly, it was recognized by this work that global nature conservation requires the participation of local people. In 1992, representatives of over 150 countries met in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil, for United Nations Conference for Environmental and Development, popularly known as Earth Summit. The Earth Summit established important linkage between environment and sustained to further development of concept of sustainable development. It produced the Earth Character, a code of conduct or plan of action for 21st century, that is Agenda 21 and Local Agenda 21, LA 21, and interpretation for local issues which came later. The Climate Convention, the Convention to control the climate change due to atmospheric pollution, and the Biodiversity Convention, and a convention to promote the conservation of biodiversity. The Rio Declaration also set out the framework of principle of conservation and use of forest and establishment of important steps that needed to ensure an environmentally stable and sustainable planet. Correspondingly, at the international level, many nation states have been trying to go ahead with the notion of sustainable development. They are striving to find out economic and political solutions for environmental problems. One also notices periodical attempts to take stock of the progress made by nations in the direction of sustainable development. For instance, in 1997, Rio Plus 5 meet was held in New York in order to assess the progress towards sustainable development. Again, as a further step, the World Summit of Sustainable Development was held at Johannesburg from 26th August to 4th September 2002. The Johannesburg Summit is recognized as Rio Plus 10. The agenda for this international meet was much beyond the review of progress made in the direction of sustainable development in the 10th years since Rio. The agenda included every possible issue related to environment and development: energy, water, sanitation, health, forest, consumption patterns, poverty, trade, globalisation, etc. Thus, the scope of sustainable development was broadened. Sustainable development was seen as a comprising three components: economic development, social development, and environment protection. The newspaper reports which appeared during the summit period highlighted that there were discussions and debates over many issues, which include call for reduction of poverty, saving the planet's far dwindling resources from further plundering, criticism against the European and American pattern of agriculture subsidies, and a need to eliminate the trade distorting subsidies, dispute on the definition of globalization, and demands by the third world countries for more aid, finance, and fairer trade. Thus, various international environment and publication has contributed to making of the concept of sustainable development. Let us understand now and the definition and meaning of the concept of sustainable development as formulated and elaborated in our Common Future 987. Reflections and action 4.2. Is sustainable development a social movement? What are the historical genesis of this movement? 4.4. Concept of sustainable development as defined in our Common Future. The definition of the term sustainable development, its meaning, requirements, policy objectives, and suitable strategy as mentioned in the report Our Common Future have been briefly dealt with below. The next, inserted within quotes, is adapted for the chapter for the Commission's report Our Common Future, reproduced under the titles Towards Sustainable Development in Science Age. A sustainable development definition and meaning of the concept. The definition of the concept sustainable development put forward in the report titled Our Common Future is: sustainable development is the development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. It contains within it two key concepts: the concept of needs, in particular the essential needs of the world's poor, to which overriding priority should be given, and the idea of limitation imposed by the state of technology and social organization on the environment's ability to meet present and the future needs. In order to understand the meaning of the definition, let us understand the core issues addressed in the above definition. First is the issue of economic growth. The economic growth is not only considered essential for poverty reduction but also meeting human needs and aspirations for better life. Second is the issue of limitations of environment's ability to meet the needs of the present and future generation. Due to the pressures generated by growing societal needs, societies are using modern technologies for extracting and utilizing natural resources, which are limited. If we continue to exploit existing limited natural resources, future generation will not be able to meet their own needs. Thus, environment's ability to meet present and future generation need has certain limits. This realization is clearly reflected in the definition. Thus, the concept of sustainable development is based on an integrated view of development and environment. It recommends pursuance of development strategies and in order to maximize economic growth from a given ecological milieu on one hand and to minimize the risk and the hazards to the environment on the other. for being able to meet the needs and aspirations of the present generation without compromising the ability to meet those of the future generations. In short, the above definition of sustainable development implies that we should direct our efforts towards readdressing the damage already done to the environment by earlier unsustainable patterns of economic growth, and we should follow such a pattern of development which avoids further damage to the planet's ecosystem and ensures meeting of the needs of present as well as future human generation. B. Sustainable development requirements. While elaborating the concept, the report Our Common Future in 1987 also brings out the requirement of sustainable development. For a better understanding of the concept, some of the important requirements of sustainable development can be highlighted. Sustainable development requires meeting the basic needs of all and extending to all the opportunity to satisfy their aspiration for a better life. The promotion of values that encourage consumption standards that are within the bounds of ecologically possible and to which all can reasonably aspire. That societies meet human needs both by increasing productive potential and by ensuring equitable opportunities for all. Demographic developments are in harmony with the changing productive potential of the ecosystem. At a minimum, development must not endanger the natural system that support life on Earth. The atmosphere, the waters, the soils, and the living beings. The world must ensure equitable access to the constrained resources and reorient technological efforts to relieve the pressure. That the rate of depletion of non-renewable resources should be foreclosed as few future opinion as possible. The conservation of planet and animal species. That the adverse impact on the quality of air, water, and other natural elements are minimized so as to sustain the ecosystem's overall integrity. It is also added that, in essence, sustainable development is a process of change in which the exploitation of resources, the direction of investment, the orientation of technological development, and institutional change are all in harmony and enhance both current and future potential to meet human needs and aspiration. Box 4.1 Genesis of the concept of sustainable development in official international discourse. Event: the Stockholm Conference. Discovery of public product. Modern industrial societies realize that there is only one world. Character: a first official recognition of environmental deterioration. Event: the work of the Club of Rome. Limits to growth. Realization: discovery is that realization of impossibility of infinite growth with finite resources. Character: the first official studies of global environmental deterioration. First official studies. This is recognition. In Global 2000, commissioned by President Carter, published in 1980, ignored by President Reagan. Realization that northern lifestyles cannot be reproduced globally. A first diagnostic of the cause of global environmental deterioration. World Conservation Strategy, published by IUCN, UNEP, and WWF. Nature conservation can be achieved regardless of human welfare in the vicinity. First global strategy for nature conservation and introduction of concept of sustainable development. Then World Commission on Environment and Development publishes Our Common Future in 1987. It comes with a discovery that first official definition of the concept of sustainable development and the first suggestion of an international strategy for confronting the crisis of modernity. That is the character. So second World WCS, World Conservation Strategy, Caring for the Earth, a Strategy for Sustainable Living, IUCN and INEP and WWF in 1991. In that, global nature conservation requires the participation of local people. That is the findings. Then the character is that it is revised global strategy for or nature conservation. This is the character. And United Nations Conference on Environment and Development, the Earth Summit in 1992, the Earth Charter, Agenda 21 and Climate Convention and Biodiversity Convention. In this, a code of human conduct for 21st century was defined. A convention to control the climate change due to atmospheric pollution has been done. a convention to promote the conservation of the biodiversity. So done. So this is the way the genesis of the concept of sustainable development in official international discourse. In sustainable development policy objectives, the report Our Common Future 1987 also recommends that in order to move on the path of sustainable development, all nations are required to bring about certain policy changes. It has been noted that the critical objectives of environment and development policies that follow from the concept of sustainable development includes reviving growth, changing the quality of growth, meeting essentials need for jobs, food, energy, water and sanitation, ensuring a sustainable level of population, conserving and enhancing the resource base, reorienting technology and managing the risk, and seventh, merging environment and economics in decision making. D. Sustainable development suitable strategy. Regarding suitable strategy, the report Our Common Future notes in its broadcast sense that the strategy for sustainable development aims to promote harmony among human beings and between humanity and nature. In the specific context of development and environment, the pursuit of sustainable development requires a political system that secures effective citizen participation in decision making. Second, an economic system that is able to generate surpluses and technical knowledge on a self-reliant and sustainable basis. Third, a social system that provides for solutions to the tensions arising from disharmonious development. Fourth, a production system that respects the obligation to preserve the ecological base for the development. Fifth, a technological system that can search continuously for new solutions. Sixth, an international system that fosters sustainable patterns of trade and finance. And seventh, an administrative system that is flexible and has the capacity for self-correction. These requirements are more in the nature of goals that should be underlying national and international action of development. Let us now turn our attention towards critique of the concept of sustainable development. In Reflections and Action 4.3, to do select a development project known to you, explain the reasons why this project is or is not sustainable. 4.5, Criticism of the concept of sustainable development. The concept of sustainable development as defined by the Brundtland Commission has been subjected to critical scrutiny by many scholars. The criticism not only point out the logical contradiction and semantic ambivalence in term, but also center on its vagueness, ambiguity of the terms and phrases, including in the definition, point towards difficulties at the operational level, and attempt to uncover implicit assumptions and political motives. A sustainable development, logical contradiction, and semantic ambivalence. Scholars like Ramesh Diwan takes an extreme stand and express the view that the concept of sustainable development represents a contradiction in term itself. He remarks that development and sustainability are not only incompatible with each other, they are contradictory as well. In other words, sustainable is not development. Such a view clearly implies that the term development used in any sense, say economic growth or growth with equity or improvement in quality of life or modernization, inevitably leads to an increase in the level of consumption and also to the exploitation of natural resources. According to Wolfgang Sanchez, the linkage of the term sustainable to development has created a terrain of semantic ambivalence. In his words, within a new concept, the locus of sustainability has subtly shifted from the nature to development. While sustainable previously referred to natural yields, it now refers to development, and the perceptual frame also changes. Instead of nature, development becomes the objective of concern, and instead of development, nature becomes the critical factor to be watched. In short, the meaning of sustainability slides from conservation of nature to conservation of development. B. Definition of sustainable development, vague and ambiguous. In the opinion of Sukhumoi Chakravarti, the phrase sustainable development says nothing precise and therefore means anything to anybody. Anil Agrawal adds, for a logging company, it can mean sustained project. For an environmental economics, it can mean sustained stocks of natural forest. For a social ecologist, it can mean sustained use of forest. And for an environmentalist, it can mean a clean heritage for our children, but surely confusion cannot be more productive than clarity. The observations of William F. Fisher shows persons with different viewpoints, holding different philosophical positions, having different goals in mind, and advocating different means to achieve desired ends, use the same moral vocabulary of social justice and the same economic rhetoric of sustainable development. In his view, sustainable development has become a term that is used to justify whatever one does and, by implication, criticize those in differing goals, strategies, and opinions. Widely debated Sardar Sarovar project in India is the case in point. Fisher writes, dam proponents and opponents seems sincere in their commitment to goals of sustainable development and social justice, but what they mean by these terms differs. Box 4.2 is Sardar Sarovar project, an example of sustainable development. William F. Fisher's observations are quite illustrative in this context. He writes, the proponents of Sardar Sarovar Dam insist that sustainable development is compatible with large-scale, ambitious, centrally controlled schemes which are capable of mitigating the effects of natural catastrophes and meeting the increasing needs of growing economy for food, water, and energy. For their perspective, the Narmada runoff is a perennially renewed resource that currently goes to waste. Dam advocates argue that domesticating this untapped source would enable Gujarat to sustain its environment growth and the standard of living of its population. Project planners and supporters argue that the readily apparent and increasing needs for water in drought-prone areas from both agricultural growth and a growing economy justify the projected means and the cost of damming the Narmada and relocating those currently residing in the submergence area of the reservoir. On the other hand, critics of the Sardar Sarovar project questions in the portrayal of Sardar Sarovar as an example of sustainable development and see it instead of as another project that will overexploit the available resources to the determiner of the poor and the benefit of the rich. They argue that by any measure, the project is unsustainable and unjust. They note that the size and the comprehensiveness of the scheme like Sardar Sarovar requires that these schemes be initiated, financed, and managed by the state as the guardian of the interest of the people. For these critics, sustainable development is not top-down but bottom-up approach. It requires that development efforts be decentralized and requires the involvement of local people at all levels of the design and appraisal and implementation of project. For them, sustainable development should be as concerned with the justice and equity as it is with the ecology, sustainable use of resources. From the perspective advocated by these critics, large-scale centrally controlled schemes are incompatible with the sustainable development. Not only does the term sustainable development mean different things to different persons or groups, its meaning also differs from one set of nations from that of the others. As Sevilla Guzman, Eduardo, and Graham Woodgate have brought out, the official disclosure as represented in the Brundtland Committee report, Our Common Future, seems to differentiate between the meaning of sustainable development as it applies to industrial nations and its implication for countries whose economies were relatively less industrialized. For the latter, first, it means the realization of the potential of economic growth. Second, it promotes generalized increases in levels of consumption. For highly industrialized nations, the sustainable development allows for the continuous realization of nations' growth potential. So long as it is not achieved at the expense of others, such growth will continue to be industrial in nature, as according to the World Commissions on Environment and Development, industrial production is of fundamental importance to the economies of the modern societies and an indispensable motor of growth. C.R. Reddy also views the Commission's definition as simple but vague. In the words of Wolfgang Sanchez, Upon closer inspection, one notes that the definition given by the Woodland Commission does not refer to the greatest number, but focus instead on the needs of the present and those of the future generations. While the crisis of the nature has been constitutive of the concept of sustainable development, the crisis of justice finds only a faint echo in the notion of development and needs. In the definition, the attention to the dimensions of time is not counterbalanced by an equal attention to the dimensions of space. It is therefore no exaggeration to say that the canonical definition has resolved the dilemma of nature versus justice in favor of nature. But two crucial questions remain unanswered: what's need and whose needs? Is sustainable development supposed to meet the needs for water, the land, economic security, or the needs for the air travel and bank deposit? It is concerned with the survival needs or with the luxury needs. Are the needs in question are those of the global consumer class or those of the numerous numbers have-nots? The Brundtland report remained ambiguous throughout, largely sidestepping the crisis of justice has not been without consequences in the years that have followed. Ratnaredi, referring to the concern for meeting the needs of future generation expressed in the Commission's definition, say, at the conceptual level, it is difficult to circumvent the conflicts between the present and future generation interest. While the need are conceived differently from one environment and culture to another in the same generation, how future generation will receive of their needs may well be beyond our imagination. See critic relating to the operational substance of the definition. While raising doubts regarding the operational substance of the definition, Anil Agrawal asked, who is going to ensure the rights of the future generations when, given the highly divided world we live in, a large proportion of even the present generation cannot meet all its needs? Given such a social and political context, the definition also fails to say whose future generation needs are being sought to be protected and preserved. Are we talking only of the future generation of the rich or also the poorer? Again, C.R. Reddy comments that while an entire UN machinery has been created around sustainable development, the world is still waiting for an operational meaning of what is an intuitively appealing but yes fuzzy concept. In a similar vein, W.F. Fisher observed that while this widespread commitment to the term sustainable development might suggest a growing worldwide consensus on the need for development that is sustainable, there is no agreement about the specific goals of sustainable development or the appropriate means to achieve them. About the Brundtland Commission's definition of the term, he further observes that it defines an arena of intense debate, not an arena of consensus. Used in so many varying ways, sustainable development has broad appeal but cannot help direct a set of action towards specific goal, nor can it offer any guidelines about how trade-off has to be balanced among these goals. Instead, the term obscure rather than clarifies the central issues of balancing the need of for income redistribution and economic growth with resource limits and population growth. D. Critics relating to politics of sustainable development. K.R. Nair looks at the concept of sustainable development as a political instrument and is critical of many aspects of Commission's definition. He argues that the concept of sustainable development has emerged from those countries which themselves practice unsustainable resource use, and further adds that the politics of sustainable development is that at present it is anti-south, anti-poor and thereby anti-ecological. Nair also comments that the need with reference to the sustainable development is affluence rather than basic or opulence rather than squalor, because when basic needs become an integral component of a development model, the question of unsustainability does not arise. He further adds the cyclical relationship between poverty and environmental degradation is conceptualized in simplistic terms. The conception is that as poverty increases, natural environment are degraded, and when environment degrade, The prospects for further livelihood decrease. Environmental degradation generates more poverty, thus accelerating the cycle. While the basic factors which generate poverty are kept outside this framework, it also does not consider the role of lopsided development, which degrade the natural capital, and the issues of artificially inflated impact of the poorer on the already lower quality of natural capital set in motion by factors other than poverty. While uncovering the implicit political motive behind the Western concern for curtailment of population growth in the development countries for sustainable development, Nair expressed the view that the sustainable development is visualized as a solution to make available raw material on a continuous basis so that the production system, the expanding market, and the political system are not threatened. The raw materials in the developing countries thereby needed to be protected and their population growth curtailed so that the resources would remain easily available. Again, in his opinion, not in my backyard or NIMBY syndrome is mainly responsible for ecologically unsustainable development projects, including hazardous industries shifting out of these countries to developing countries. When the aim is to suggest patchwork solution to the unsustainable production system of the north, population growth in the south automatically becomes the target of debate on sustainable development. Reflections and action 4.3. What are the major vagueness built in the concept of sustainable development in your opinion? How can this vagueness be removed? 4.6. Globalization and future of sustainable development. Globalization has created new challenges in the march towards what is implied in the notion of sustainable development. Martin Core comments that the process of globalization linked to liberalization has gained so much force that it has undermined and it's undermining the sustainable development agenda. Commerce and the perceived need to remain competitive in the global market and to pamper and cater to the demands of companies and the rich have become the top priority of governments in the north and some in the south. The environment, welfare of poor, global partnership have also been dislodged and sacrificed in this wave of free market mania. The process of globalization is seen as an important reason for the failure of Johannesburg summit. In his editorial, The Hindu remarks that an important reason for the Johannesburg fiasco is that the global willingness to collectively deal with the problems of environment gradually evaporated during the past decade of accelerated globalization. The above remarks help us to critically look at the concept of sustainable development and to understand the complexities and intricacies involved in establishing relation between the crisis of nature and the crisis of justice. Given the context of differential level of socio-economic development, cultural specificities, political positions of various nation states in the north and the south, the challenges created by the force of globalization, the above criticism also underline the practical difficulties in operating the concept in space and time. Yet the concept of sustainable development can be seen to dominate the development discourse and continues to enlarge a debate across the national frontiers. 4.7 Conclusion. In this unit, we have tried to critically understand the concept of sustainable development. In this first section, we have noted that the alarming degradation of environment spawned by the Western economic growth model and of development characterized by use of modern technology and rapid industrialization and urbanization provided the historical context that gave rise to the dichotomy of development versus environment. Eventually, the growing realization that human beings need both development and environment resulted in reconciliations between development and environment, which finds its expression in concept of sustainable development. In the second section, we have traced the genesis and evolutions of concept through a brief review of some of the prominent international events and documents such as Stockholm Conference, Limits to Growth, the work of the Club of Rome, Global 2000, World Conservation Strategy, Living Resource Conservation of Sustainable Development, the report of the WCED or Common Future, Rio +5 held in New York, and WSSD held in Johannesburg, and brought out their contribution to making of the concept of sustainable development. The third section was devoted to elaborate the concept of sustainable development in terms of its definition, meaning, requirements, policy objectives, and strategic measures as conceived and defined and elaborated in the report Our Common Future. In fourth section, we have noted that the concept of sustainable development has been criticized on various grounds such as logical conditioning, involvement in the face and semantic ambivalence, its vagueness and ambiguity, doubts expressed with regards to operational substance and political motives. The process of globalization linked to liberalization is viewed as a determinant to the realization of sustainable development agenda in future. For point 8, further reading. Agarwal until 1992, What is Sustainable Development? Down to Earth. W. Fisher, Development Resistance in the Narmada Valley. S.S. Saluke, The Concept of Sustainable Development, Root, Connotations and Critical Evaluation. So this is the end of the unit 4 of Sociology of Development. Thank you very much.